Okay, so this talk is about teaching Grafana to kids and what I learned in the process. But it's also about a bigger topic, about how we can be more empathetic in how we teach fellow grown-ups and how we can have more fun and hack our own brains to learn as fast as children can. Come on, here we go. Okay. So I do site reliability for DNA Nexus, and we're a cloud computing company that works with genomics. And what we build are tools that allow researchers to analyze petabytes of DNA to try to find those needles in the haystack, such as why did these 10,000 people get cancer, but these 10,000 didn't. And just a quick plug, we are hiring for my team, so if that intersection of genomics and observability sounds interesting to you, please get in touch on my Twitter. My DMs are open. I just realized this means that nobody has to pay for closed captioning of this talk, actually, so this is an added plus. So raise your hand if you know that it's a best practice to rely on alerting, but not human eyeballs for staring at graphs all day. Okay, yeah. So keep your hands up if you stare at the graphs anyway, because they're pretty. Yeah, okay, me too. So I just can't resist, right? There's something so satisfying about that real-time information delivered exactly in a way that gives you that intuitive sense of what's going on. It's just irresistible, right? So as it turns out, it's not just irresistible to me. Whether it's some genetic trait or just a natural draw to pretty colors, my kids would always be drawn to the screen whenever they'd see Grafana on my screen too, and they'd ask, wow, what's that? So we're in the middle of triaging a production incident at work. It's not the best time to give a lesson in Grafana to the kids, but last year when my kids were 5 and 3, I wondered if there was a way that I could teach them about Grafana. And I imagined that teaching them directly these concepts about 95th percentile latencies and HTTP response codes might not be the most exciting way to do it, so I set out to find something more concrete. Now, we're all involved in cloud computing, but maintaining your own physical hardware is just so 1970s, right? But we can all acknowledge that as cool as cloud computing is, it's just kind of boring, right? So all this cool technology exists, but we can't actually reach out and touch it. So anybody know what one of these things is? Shout it out if you know what it is. Yeah, very good in the front row there. So it's a cute name for a tiny little credit card-sized computer that you can get for 30, 35 bucks. And we had a few of these laying around from all these various abandoned experiments I had done. So I thought, hey, it would be cool if we could do a project with the kids. So has anybody ever played this game with a baby where you feed the baby food, the baby grabs the food, they throw it on the floor, the grown-up has a reaction like, don't do that, and then the baby's like, oh, I got a reaction from them. And then what does the baby do immediately? Drops the food again, right? So this is a common example of a developing human brain learning about cause and effect in a pretty mind-blowing time for a baby when they're like realizing, wow, my actions actually affect the world in this big existential way, and that they can manipulate the environment around them. So I thought it would be really cool if we could tap into that underlying cause and effect being something really exciting for kids to teach about Grafana. So one kind of measurement that kids learn to understand from a very early age, when they turn on the faucet and it's too hot and they realize like, oh, too hot, is temperature, right? And too cold, right? So I found some wireless temperature and humidity sensors on Amazon for 10 bucks each, and these sensors communicate using a common radio frequency, 433 megahertz, that's used by a whole lot of other things in your house. And there's this cool little $20 receiver that you can plug into your Raspberry Pi that will actually receive radio frequencies and turn them into digital signals that then you can pipe to a Linux process and do just about whatever you want with them. There's a whole lot of things that we want to do with these that we haven't done yet. You can actually intercept frequencies from airplanes flying over your house and even get like weather satellite data. But for now, we just use this to get the signals from these temperature sensors. So we had a sensor coming to life party with the kids, and we popped the batteries in and watched them transmit a signal. And this is what it looked like when it was showing up on the screen. So every time we popped in some batteries, every sensor would broadcast its own unique sensor ID. So a new sensor ID would pop up, and we'd have the kids say, okay, let me know when you see a new number. And they'd say, 9795. Okay, cool. brand new sensor. So we'd write that one on the battery, on the sensor that we just popped the batteries in. And every 30 seconds, these send out a little ping with their sensor ID, the temperature, and the humidity levels. So from there, all we had to do was send that data to InfluxDB and graph it with Grafana, and the kids had their first dashboard to play with. And we placed sensors all around the house to see which rooms were warmer, which were more humid. We live in Colorado, so pretty much everything is zero humidity, dry as a bone. So that wasn't too exciting. But we started to learn about concepts like zooming in and out, understanding the X and Y axis, and plotting lines from those points. So we were beginning to learn the building blocks of Grafana. And it wasn't too long before the kids started to notice interesting shapes. I'm going to try presenter mode one more time. Let's see. OK, there we go. Now we're back in business. Sorry for this. I just realized there's a bunch of noisy background stuff here that I didn't want to show. But the Google gods don't want me to do this, do they? Let's see. OK, I'm just going to go back to this previous plan. That's fine. So we started to see some interesting shapes like this after they'd zoom in for a closer look. And this was a room that we thought was a pretty constant temperature, but it had this pattern. We started to learn about sawtooth patterns. And when we were like, that's interesting. Why is it going up and down, up and down, up and down? We thought that this was a constant temperature. So we used our eyes and our ears, and we listened, and we noticed that whenever the furnace would kick on, we'd have this little increase, and then the furnace would turn off, and we'd have this little decrease. And then so that started to make sense. And this was another example for the kids about making a connection between the environment around them and the data that they observed on the graph. So we also have 2 cats, and does anybody have cats that like to wake them up at like 3, 4, 5 in the morning? Like, I have an emergency, I don't like the way that shadow looks or something. And so we had this problem, and we decided we were going to give the cats their own luxury nighttime accommodations with luxury cat beds, but they would be locked in their special rooms so they couldn't bother us at night. And being in Colorado and having drafty rooms, we were worried that what if they were cold at night, and did these cat beds really work to keep them warm? So we thought, hey, we could actually use Grafana to answer this question. So we put a sensor in their cat bed in the corner inconspicuously, and we graphed Hobbs and Roibus, our 2 cats. And so we can see, they went to bed around the same time, and Roibus, who's the much more fluffier cat, had a much steeper slope towards her peak bed temperature. And Hobbs, who's the short hair, was a little bit slower to get there, but they eventually converged. And we can see that Hobbs actually got up to have a late night snack and then got back in bed. So it was cool to look at this graph with the kids the next day and ask them, what do you think happened here? Why do you think this went down? Why do you think this went up? And it was the kids' first experience looking back at historical data to piece together a story of what may have happened, right? And just like analyzing a production incident by looking at historical data, we don't always know concretely what happened, but we can look at our data to give us clues. And the kids were pretty amazed to learn that this kind of thing, looking at historical graphs like this in Grafana, this is a big part of what I do at work all day, but now it was approachable. So after we had a week's worth of data, we could zoom in and start to learn about trends. And we talked about how the 2 cat beds were correlated and followed the same shape day after day. And it wasn't long until Bowden was really into playing with the Grafana UI. So I encouraged him, don't worry about breaking stuff, just play with stuff, check boxes, move things around. Let me know if you have any questions. And he discovered the draw modes, these 3 checkboxes here, that allow you to represent the data with bars, lines, or points. And he turned our temperature graph into this. So how many of you have ever stood over the shoulder of one of your coworkers when they're learning Grafana, and you're just like, you see them doing something and it's not the way you would do it, and you say, just let me do it for you, right? Like, I'm the expert, I know what to do. So my first instinct was to say, hey, this is making this graph look too complicated, but I took a deep breath and I said, well, what do you think of this graph? And he said he liked it, so we kept it like that. But we used the opportunity to talk about reasons why sometimes people choose to represent their data with lines and charts and lines and bars and points, and why sometimes it helps the viewer to understand better. But there's not always a right or wrong way to do it. It's more of an art than a science. So this was all well and good, but we were just doing a lot of sitting around looking at graphs, right? So as winter was setting in Colorado and it was starting to get really cold, too cold to play outside, there were fewer nice days for burning energy outside. So I wondered if there was a way that we could actually use Grafana to motivate the kids to get some exercise too. So the kids have this small indoor trampoline that they occasionally enjoy a few bounces on, but I wondered if we could make it more engaging by adding some technology. So we set out to find something that could measure the movement of the trampoline. And we learned about something called an ultrasonic rangefinder, which is a sensor that measures the distance between an object and what's in front of it. And they're pretty cheap. You can buy a 5-pack of them for the price of a burrito. And it works. This looks kind of like a boombox because it actually sort of is, except instead of like thumping bass, it transmits a really high-frequency signal that's too high-pitched for human ears to hear. Some animals can, actually cats, we found out. They try to whack it and bite it because it's really annoying, I guess. But then it basically just measures the round trip of how long it takes a signal to bounce back off of something, and then you can send that to your Raspberry Pi. So it's just some physics about an equation of how to measure that. The Raspberry Pi has these nice little pins called GPIO where you can plug in just about any sort of electronics. And so the kids helped me wire this up, and it was really fun. My daughter Zenna and my son Bowden both helped me wire this up. We learned about resistors and making voltages between different devices match up, and we wound up with this. We used something called a breadboard, we learned, that white long thing, which allows you to connect wires without having to solder them together. Decided we probably weren't ready for a soldering iron yet, maybe next year. And I'm a Node developer. There's some great Node libraries for interacting with Raspberry Pis and different sensors. So we wired this up and started just moving our hand back and forth and seeing some numbers changing on the console to represent the distance from the sensor to our hand. So we were ready to wire this up to the trampoline, but first I asked the kids, what do you think this graph is going to look like? Let's make a hypothesis. And Bowden, drawing from his prior experience, enthusiastically responded with a sawtooth. So we set up the sensor and began our next experiment. But before we unveil the product we created, I wanted to show a quick video from our chief hardware designer, Zenna, who's 4 years old. She's in the audience today, and I hope you like it.
We started with a concept that's as old as humanity, jumping for joy. And we asked, how could we make a product that taps into that underlying approach? Developing the trampoline and Grafana together to find a whole new integration, making the boundary between the advice and the data hard to discern. The custom components were engineered to transparently fade under the trampoline, leaving behind a seamless surface. Under the hood, you'll find the most advanced technology we've ever created. A custom breadboard made of bread, with a nod to the fashionable jacket. In English, we chose jumper wire for the interconnectedness of our most critical components. At the heart of the product is an ultrasonic sensor, like no other. Inspired by the echolocation from the most advanced marine animals, we harness the power of sound to bring us the accuracy and trampoline observability we've never seen before. By harnessing the world's most powerful platform For data available the application, we redesigned what's possible, allowing us to observe, underline, jump data, rest up, second, resident. The best ideas start with jumping for joy. We've just taken the next leap. This is the Grafana trampoline.
Thank you, Zena. And now to unveil the Grafana trampoline, I'd like to invite my son Bowden to the stage. Everybody give a hand for Bowden. You want to help me take it off? Voila. All right. So, to go out of full screen mode here, so we can go to our sensor here. And before you get on there, we're going to kind of tell a story here. So we're going to start with the first dashboard we ever created. Let's give it a try here. Go ahead, Bowden. Let's generate some data. All right, so as Bowden's jumping here, we're zoomed into the last 5 minutes here. I'm going to change this to, let's say, last 10 seconds so we can see some data. So what do you think? Sawtooth? Was Bowden's hypothesis correct? Pretty close? Yeah, pretty close. Looks like some teeth to me. So, so we kind of had this sawtooth or a waveform or whatever you want to call it. And what we really wanted to do was to have some way to do a high score of how many jumps per minute we had done. So, so Bowden, let's actually show off some of your Grafana skills here. What do you say? Do you want to come drive this? All right. So Bowden's going to hop up here. And the first thing we need to do, we discovered that if we try to zoom in while we're refreshing, get a microphone here for Bowden. What happens if we try to zoom in while we're refreshing? Does it work very well? Not really, right?
Not really.
Not really. So can you help me turn off the refresh? Let's just turn refresh to off. Yep. So we've got refresh to off. We always remember to hit apply, right? Daddy makes that mistake sometimes too, huh?
Yeah.
And let's change last 10 seconds. Let's go back and look at our last 5 minutes here. So let's look at some historical data. Can you actually stand up a little bit? Will that work? I'll hold your hand.
No.
That way people can see you, unless you want to hide behind there. All right. So now we've got our last 5 minutes of data. And Bowden, do you want to help zoom in so we can actually see some of that jump data? Great. So how many jumps do you think are on that screen right now?
How do I get this down?
Oh, just click like that. Okay. So we got a lot of jumps there, right? Let's try to zoom in on maybe like 3 or 4 jumps. Let's pick some good ones. Pick like 3 or 4 of your favorites. Cool. So back when we were first doing this, I asked you a question, right? I said, let's pretend that you're a computer and you're just looking at this data. You never actually saw a boy jumping, but you were just looking at this screen. How many jumps on this screen are there? And what did you tell me?
1, 2, 5.
5, right? So a computer would be like, whoa, Bowden, how did you do that, right? Because a computer doesn't know what a jump means. But what were you actually counting when you answered that question?
Peaks and valleys.
Yeah, peaks and valleys. That was something we learned about when we were doing the temperature, right? But then we got to apply that knowledge with graphs. So we thought, okay, that's okay. We can make our computer program just count the peaks and valleys, because you told me that it changes when it goes from
Ascending to descending.
That counts as what? Up
and down.
That counts as up.
A peak.
Right. So so we thought, okay, cool. We'll just make our computer program recognize when it changes from a peak to a valley. But what was the problem? What did we notice when we zoomed in and looked at the tops of these peaks?
There's little tiny peaks peaks and valleys on the top of each peak and valley.
Yeah, so what would that do to our computer program? Would it give us an accurate count of our jumps?
It would give us way too many.
Way too many jumps, right? So we needed a different strategy. And we learned about something called, what was it called?
Sampling.
Sampling. And is that where we get to go to Costco?
No,
and
but
eat a bunch of...
let's show the slide of it.
Oh yeah, we have a slide about what we didn't get to do.
Let's do the slide. Let's do the
Yeah.
slide.
So we
There
love
we
to go to
go.
Costco for samples,
There
but
you
we
go.
didn't really get to do that for this kind of sampling. What does this kind of sampling mean? Does it mean that we look at every single point of data?
It means that we take just some of it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so we figured out, we played with some different things, and we figured out that if we took a sample every 50 milliseconds, that it would filter out all of those noisy, tiny little peaks and valleys. And it wound up with something that looked like this, where we could count just peaks and valleys that were in between jumps. But then, did we want it to count if you just did like a lazy little pitter-patter on the trampoline?
We had to do big jumps.
Yeah, we wanted to count
Like,
big jumps.
not too big, but big
Right.
enough.
So we learned about something called a
Threshold.
right? And so what does a threshold mean for this?
It means it has to go above the blue line
Uh-huh.
to count as a peak, and underneath the red line to count as a valley.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So when we put that all together, that's okay. So when we put that all together, let's show another graph of what that looked like with the counting the peaks and the valleys. And why don't you jump some more, bud? So let's show our version 2 of our trampoline here, of our graph. And I'll change this to last 10 seconds. And now we can see when we've got a detected peak, we have a red dot and or a blue dot, and a valley is the red dot. And guess where this idea for superimposing the points onto the line graph came from? From Bowden's earlier idea where he was playing with checking all those boxes, right? So that was an example of how I, as the teacher, got to have an experience of learning from my student and being like, oh yeah, that idea you had before, like that's totally something we could use now. So when we put this all together, we created a dashboard that looks like this. And it's counting not only the real-time jumps, and you can tell that some of the lazy ones didn't have a peak and valley, but what are we seeing on the bottom here? What's that bar graph showing, Bowden? Can you talk while you're jumping?
Yes, but the bar graph is showing. What is it showing?
Jumps per.
Jumps per minute.
Yeah, and why is that bar graph on the very right side going up?
Because I'm jumping.
Yeah.
Oops, that was mud. Because I'm jumping.
Right.
That
So.
was too loud.
So we can actually have a high score here, and we play this game where we try to have our bar graph on the right beat the tallest bar, and this keeps us exercised when it's cold outside, right? So yeah, awesome. All right, Bowden. So you wanted to actually share some experiences from some of your other favorite moments, right? Do you want to talk about this one? I think you have kind of a stumper for the audience, right?
Don't tell him.
Oh, okay. Well, I won't tell them the stumper thing. All right. Well, you had a question you wanted to ask, right?
Raise your hand if you think that graph's gonna go up.
So we have a temperature sensor in front of the fireplace. Raise your hand if you think the graph's going to go up when we put it there. Okay.
Raise your hand if you think it's gonna go down.
Okay. Somebody's, I shouldn't have said it was a trick question, I guess. Somebody's onto that. Okay. And was there a third option?
Raise your hand if you think it's gonna stay the same.
Okay.
Any?
Nobody for that. Okay. So,
see, it went up.
but are those people totally right?
No,
Why not?
you're half right if
Half
you
right?
said it was gonna go up.
Because, what else did you figure out?
we put it underneath an ice pack, and it went down.
So even though it was in front of the fireplace, it still went down? Wow, that's not what I would have expected. So anyway.
Wait, it's just in gray and black.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's doing that. Anyway, thanks, Bowden. Let's give it a hand for Bowden. You can go sit back down with Mommy. Or you can stay up here if you want. So, yeah, you can come up too if you want. I wanted to talk a little bit about what motivates us. So Zena wants to come up here too for this. So sometimes in education or even at work, we learn about extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation. So extrinsic is where you do something to get a reward. Intrinsic is where you do something just for the joy of doing it. So Bowden had this cool idea that just a couple days ago, just before the conference, and actually, do you want to talk about this? Because this idea was super cool.
I had an idea to put water in a pot and then put the sensor on top and then put a lid on.
Yeah, so I had nothing to do with this idea, but Bowden had this idea, and we had never actually done anything interesting with the humidity sensor. We were just like, yeah, it's really dry in Colorado, big surprise. But Bowden had a hypothesis that the humidity would go up, and it did. But the really cool thing was that this was over a few minutes, but when we observed it over the course of like 24 hours, it did this really cool unexpected shape. And I think a lot of us know that in science, a lot of the best discoveries start with somebody saying, that's weird. So indeed, this was an unexpected result. It wasn't just this constant, going up. It actually reminded me of something I vaguely remembered from high school math of a logarithmic curve. And maybe somebody who understands environmental science can tell me why humidity rises this way. But it gave us so much more stuff to investigate that we hadn't even thought about. So anyway, this I thought was a great example of intrinsic motivation, because Bowden just was so enamored with Grafana that he just wanted to use it for experiments of his own invention. So I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we could bring this excitement back to work as well? Because sometimes, raise your hand if you've ever struggled to get a colleague to be as excited about Grafana as you are. Okay, yeah, me too. So, but we want our colleagues to know these tools so that when they need them most, they'll be familiar with them. So I tried something where I organized a game day. It's a concept where you get everybody in a room and you try to break stuff. And we elected a member of our team to be the chaos monkey and try to, shut things down and kill processes. And for a lot of the people in the room, it was their first time actually getting into the weeds with Grafana. And even though they, had maybe used it before, sort of casually, this was their first time using it, to actually debug an incident in the moment. And the joy on their faces when they made a prediction about what was going to happen when we messed something up, and then seeing it in Grafana was actually really, really cool. And I got a lot of feedback from people that hey, I learned so much more from doing this than I did just from reading the docs. So just like that baby that experiences the joy of cause and effect from dropping food, or a kid getting excited about seeing their trampoline jumps, even senior engineers can see this cause and effect and be excited about it. And if this isn't just some idealistic fantasy that we have more fun, that when we have fun while we're learning, we learn better. It's actually backed by real science. So for some explain it like I'm 5 neuroscience, there's about 100 billion of these brain cells in your head. And when we learn something new, we're literally rewiring our brain at the physical level. We're creating new connections between the transmitting parts of our brain. Can you get down there okay? Okay. And the receiving end, called the synapse. And this allows us to not only to retrieve these new memories, but literally to think in new ways as well.
Can I talk about something?
What do you want to talk about, bud?
What you're talking about?
There's this concept called neuroplasticity, where when our brain doesn't always work as well as it could or should, but this term describes the ability to reorganize these synaptic connections in response to learning. And as adults, sometimes we don't have as much neuroplasticity as kids, but that's not necessarily just a gloomy fact. There's actually good news that there's some peer-reviewed studies that show that when we combine learning and emotion, we can improve our neuroplasticity. So there's a fantastic book called Superbrain that I really recommend. There's a great quote that's backed by a lot of neuroscience that when you become passionate and excited about learning, the way children are, you can actually cause new dendrites and synapses to form in your brain physically, and your memory can be as strong as when you were younger. So wrapping up, takeaways from today, explain like they're 5 and learn like you're 5. So you're all the subject matter experts on Grafana and observability, and many of you are the go-to person in your org. But when you're helping somebody with doing something with Grafana or observability, try to resist the temptation to do all the work for them and just because it's easier. Let them tinker, let them struggle, and if you can be there next to them when they have that aha moment, when it clicks, you can share in that emotional learning moment, and you can build some new synaptic connections yourself and improve your own neuroplasticity. Takeaway 2, don't just observe your environment, manipulate it. So exploit the fact that we're all hardwired to feel excited about cause and effect. And if you've got a dashboard with really flat, predictable patterns, organize a game day and challenge everyone around you to take control of the environment and make the graphs change. So knock down servers and cause a DDoS attack, and you might be surprised what you find, and the excitement of tinkering helps to solidify that memory of how the system works for you and your colleagues, so that when you're dealing with a real firefight, those neural pathways are already strengthened when you need them. And share the excitement at home. So in our industry, we've gotten used to kind of giving dismissive answers when people ask what we do. We sometimes say, computer stuff. We keep the website up and running. And we assume it's just boring or too esoteric for non-technical people to understand. But everybody here is so lucky to work with this technology, Grafana, that is actually approachable for non-technical people, even young children, even people who can't read. And Grafana is so fun to use that it can just really help to drive that intrinsic motivation and emotional learning. So if anybody's interested in building a Grafana trampoline at home, I've actually got a few starter kits with all the electronic components you'll need bagged up and ready to go. Come meet me. We'll be hanging out in the break area for a little bit after the talk. And I apologize in advance if it makes your TSA experience a little more hands-on. So here's my Twitter and my blog where you can find the plans and code for how to get this working. Feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to hear from anybody, especially those who might want to collaborate on future projects like this to help get kids involved in observability. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Dave. That was great. And another round of applause for your assistance, I think.